The scream cut across the empty vineyard like a blade. Clara dropped the bucket when she heard the lawyer announce, without lifting his eyes, that all of that now belonged to her. The gate was locked behind her, the iron creaking like a belated warning. Before her, endless rows of dry grapevines, twisted branches, land cracked by abandonment. The man who had humiliated her for years was dead, and even so had managed one last gesture of cruelty. Clara felt her chest tighten, not in surprise, but with an old weariness. She was 42 years old and carried in her hands the signs of a lifetime of invisible work. She had come young to that property, fleeing a small town where there was neither work nor future. Alvaro Montenegro had hired her as a live-in maid, promising stability. He gave her a tiny room, rationed food, and constant orders. He never called her by her name, only woman. For 15 years, Clara cleaned, cooked, harvested, pruned, listened to insults, and swallowed her pride because she needed to survive. In recent times, Alvaro had fallen ill. He had become even more bitter, suspicious, cruel. He had ordered part of the productive vines to be torn out after a dispute with partners, refused to invest in irrigation, let the vineyard dry out of stubbornness. Clara had watched everything in silence, feeling a strange pain, as if that land were also part of her. At night, when no one saw, she watered some plants with improvised buckets, trying to save what seemed impossible. On the day of the reading of the will, Clara believed she would be dismissed with nothing. But the lawyer pushed a thin envelope in her direction and explained too quickly that useless portion of the property had been left to her. The rest, the house, the money, the equipment, had been sold to pay debts and benefit distant heirs. The dry vineyard was a burden, not a gift. A short laugh escaped the lawyer before he left, leaving Clara alone in the middle of nowhere. She walked among the dead rows, touching the brittle branches, remembering when those plants bore sweet fruit. Anger came strongly, accompanied by shame. She sat on the ground and cried as she had not cried in years, feeling small, disposable, ridiculous for still expecting justice from someone like Alvaro. She thought about leaving, abandoning everything, looking for any job in the city. But something prevented her from getting up immediately. That night, she slept in the old shed, wrapped in a thin blanket. The wind passed freely through the cracks, bringing the smell of dry earth. Clara barely slept. She thought about what she would do at dawn, about how to explain to herself that once again she had been left behind. Before the sun rose, she got up to fetch water from an old well she rarely used. As she pushed a forgotten wooden door, she noticed something different on the ground. Under loose planks, there was a narrow opening. Clara knelt, brushed away the dust, and felt a breath of cool air. With effort, she managed to go down a few stone steps. Down there, a short tunnel led to an underground spring, still active, silent, hidden. She stood still, her heart racing, trying to understand why Alvaro had never mentioned that. The water ran clean, constant, like an ancient secret. Clara climbed back up trembling, not from cold, but from something close to hope, a feeling she had almost forgotten. She spent the entire day exploring the surrounding area, finding old notes in a shed, simple maps, marks on the ground. She did not understand everything, but she knew how to recognize when something important had been deliberately hidden. For the first time since the reading of the will, she felt that perhaps that inheritance was not just a punishment. Even so, fear spoke loudly. She had no money, no formal education, no support. Just a dead vineyard and a buried secret. At nightfall, she sat at the door of the shed, watching the sky change color, trying to decide whether that was madness or destiny. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments what you thought of the story and which city or country you are watching from. Dawn arrived carrying the weight of reality. Clara spent the morning trying to understand old documents scattered around the shed, papers that Alvaro had kept without order, as if he wanted to confuse anyone who dared to look. There were incomplete irrigation maps, bills never paid, aggressive letters from former partners. Little by little, the image of the man who had exploited her for so many years became clearer. Alvaro was not cruel merely out of habit. He feared losing control, feared that someone would discover what he had hidden. In the nearby village, Alvaro's name still provoked strong reactions. When Clara showed up to buy bread on credit, she felt the curious and suspicious looks. Some whispered, others pretended not to see her. An older shopkeeper remarked, without any restraint, that she would not last a month on that land. He said the vineyard was cursed, that Alvaro had let it die out of pride and anger after an anonymous complaint had nearly cost him everything. Clara did not respond, but she kept every word. As the days passed, she began to grasp the scale of the problem. The land was dry on the surface, the old irrigation system had been sabotaged, hoses cut, valves broken. Alvaro had done this deliberately before dying, as if he wanted to ensure that no one would prosper there after him. The inheritance was a final provocation. Clara felt the anger grow, an anger different from the resignation that had always accompanied her. At night, alone in the shed, she remembered old scenes. Alvaro shouting because dinner had gone cold, laughing when she asked for a day off, accusing her of theft without proof. He liked to remind her that she had nowhere to go. Now, even dead, he tried to repeat the gesture. But something had changed. For the first time, Clara did not need to lower her head before him. She decided to seek help, even without knowing exactly how to ask. She knocked on the door of Helena Duarte, a retired teacher who had been a distant friend of Alvaro's late wife. Helena received Clara with surprise and caution. She had heard terrible stories about the man, but had never imagined he would leave the maid in such a situation. When Clara mentioned the underground spring, the old woman's eyes changed. There was something there that she recognized. Helena said that years earlier, Alvaro's wife had studied sustainable agriculture. She spoke of hidden water, of ancient methods, of patience. After her death, Alvaro had forbidden any mention of the subject. He ordered notebooks destroyed, expelled technicians, called it all a waste of time. Clara listened in silence, feeling loose pieces slowly fall into place. The teacher did not promise money or quick solutions. She offered books, advice, difficult questions. She said the vineyard was not dead, only dormant, and that waking it would require more than strength. It would require discipline and time. Clara returned home with a stack of old books and a head full of doubts, but also with something new pulsing inside her. Meanwhile, Alvaro's distant heirs began to move. One of them appeared one afternoon, accompanied by a real estate agent, offering to buy the land for a paltry amount. He spoke with false cordiality, as if he were doing her a favor. Clara felt her stomach twist, but she refused. The man laughed, warning that she would end up accepting when hunger set in. That threat echoed for days. Without immediate income, Clara had to improvise. She began harvesting wild lavender that grew in the less damaged parts of the land. She dried the flowers, sewed small sachets at night, sold them at the church fair on Sundays. It was not much, but it paid for the basics. Some people began to look at her with less disdain. Others continued to wait for her fall. The work was exhausting. During the day, she studied, cleared channels, tested the spring water. At night, she sewed until her fingers hurt. There were days when she thought about giving up. On one of them, an attempt to irrigate an entire row failed, and part of the plants rotted. Clara sat on the ground, covered in mud, and cried in frustration, feeling deceived once again, now by her own dream. But something prevented her from stopping. Perhaps it was the memory of all the years she had endured humiliation. Perhaps it was wounded pride. Perhaps it was the certainty that that vineyard had not chosen to die, it had been forced. Just like her. Little by little, Clara began to be seen in a different way. No longer just the discarded maid, but the stubborn woman who insisted where no one believed. Alvaro's antagonism remained present, even in his absence. In every broken pipe, in every torn document, in every laugh Clara remembered. He had tried to control everything until the end, including the failure of others. Understanding this gave Clara a strange clarity. The vineyard was the final battlefield of a man who had never been able to bear losing. And without realizing it, Clara was beginning to prepare herself to win, even without yet knowing how. Clara began to live as if she carried a secret in her body. Nothing in her routine revealed what she was really doing. To those observing from the outside, she was just the stubborn woman who kept trying to save a doomed vineyard. She woke early, worked until the sun went down, returned to the shed tired and silent. But beneath that simple appearance, something was being built with almost invisible care. The nights became her most important territory. By the dim light of an old lamp, Clara studied the books borrowed from Helena, wrote observations in improvised notebooks, drew maps of the property. She began to understand patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. The position of the hills, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the underground water. She discovered that part of the vineyard had dried not only because of neglect, but because of deliberate interference with the soil. Using old tools, she began to reopen buried channels, always in small sections, so as not to draw attention. She learned to work with the rhythm of the land, not against it. Instead of trying to revive everything at once, she chose a few specific rows, the most protected ones, to test methods. It was a slow, almost frustrating process, but Clara felt a strange peace in following a plan that no one else knew. During the day, she continued selling lavender sachets and small handmade products. This simple trade gave her something beyond money. It gave her listening. People began to talk to her at the fair, to ask how the vineyard was doing, to tell old stories about that land. One man commented, without knowing its importance, that his grandfather spoke of a hidden spring that had saved the plantation decades earlier. Clara just smiled and kept the information. There was a moment when almost everything collapsed. An inspector appeared without warning, alleging complaints about irregular use of the land. Clara felt fear rise in her throat. She had spent her entire life being unfairly accused, and now this threatened to destroy the little she had built. The man examined the area, asked curt questions, wrote things down in a notebook. In the end, he left without explaining anything. Clara spent the night awake, imagining the worst. In the following days, she decided to be even more careful. She began to record every step, every intervention, every expense. She did not fully trust anyone, but she learned to observe who truly wanted to help her. Helena continued to appear from time to time, bringing new books, correcting mistakes, but never giving ready-made answers. "You need to understand it yourself," she said. Clara began to like that. For the first time, learning was not an imposed obligation, but a choice. An unexpected discovery changed the pace of the plan. While clearing an area near the old shed, Clara found a small notebook wrapped in plastic, buried under stones. The pages were yellowed, but legible. They were detailed notes about the soil, the water, the resting time of the vines. The handwriting was not Alvaro's. Clara felt a chill when she realized that those ideas had been deliberately ignored, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pride. That notebook brought clarity and also pain. It became evident that the vineyard could have been saved years earlier. Alvaro had chosen to let it die rather than admit he needed to change. Clara felt anger, but also a heavy responsibility. Now, she knew too much to give up. She began to work with even more discipline, respecting the indicated cycles, accepting that some losses were necessary for a true rebirth. Money remained scarce. There were weeks when Clara ate only bread and thin soup. On one of those difficult nights, she sat on the floor of the shed, exhausted, and seriously thought about selling everything. The offer was still open, the value low, but enough to start over somewhere else. She cried in silence, feeling selfish for insisting on a dream that only she believed in. But when she lifted her eyes, she saw something through the window that made her stop. One of the rows she had treated with the most care showed small green shoots. They were discreet, almost shy, but real. Clara approached, touched the leaves carefully, as if they were too fragile to exist. Her heart raced. It was not a miracle, nor a complete victory, but it was proof. The land responded. She fell to her knees and laughed alone, between tears and earth, feeling a contained deep joy she had never experienced before. From that day on, Clara began to act with even more strategy. She decided not to announce anything, not to celebrate in public. She knew that early success could attract unwanted interest. She continued pretending difficulties, complaining about the heat, the difficult soil, the bills. Meanwhile, she strengthened what worked and abandoned what failed, without emotional attachment. She learned to make mistakes without punishing herself. The broker came back to look for her, now with a slightly better offer. He said he was trying to help her before it was too late. Clara thanked him and refused again, keeping a humble tone. Inside, she felt a silent satisfaction. For the first time, it was not she who was cornered. There was something growing beneath the surface, and no one but her knew how much that could change everything. Clara began to save part of the little money she earned, investing in better tools, specific seeds, small improvements. Each decision was thought of as part of a larger whole. There was no hurry, only consistency. Sometimes, she walked through the vineyard at dusk, imagining what that place could be, not in wealth, but in dignity. She did not want to prove anything to anyone. She just wanted the effort to make sense. Without realizing it, Clara had stopped acting merely to survive. Now she was building something in silence, with method, patience, and a faith that made no noise. The vineyard, once a symbol of punishment, was becoming a space of preparation. And while the world still saw her as the abandoned woman with dry land, something much greater was being cultivated away from curious eyes. The first public sign that something had changed appeared almost accidentally. A grape buyer from a neighboring region entered the property by mistake, looking for a shortcut. He stopped the car when he saw green rows where only dead branches had existed. He walked a few meters, touched the leaves, tasted a still young grape. He said nothing to Clara that day, but he left with a restlessness he could not ignore. Within a few weeks, comments began to circulate in the village. Clara noticed the movement before hearing any direct words. People passing more slowly along the road, lingering looks, disguised questions at the market. She continued acting as if nothing were happening. Inside, however, her heart beat faster. She knew the moment of exposure was approaching, and with it, the inevitable confrontation with everything that had been denied to her for years. The harvest of that first small batch was done almost in silence. Clara worked alone, choosing grape by grape, respecting the right timing, refusing shortcuts. She was not seeking quantity, but quality. She used improvised equipment, followed the notes from the notebook she had found, trusted observation more than ready-made formulas. When the first wine was ready, she did not celebrate. She tasted it alone, sitting on the floor of the improvised cellar, and cried. Not out of euphoria, but out of relief. The wine was good. Not perfect, but honest, balanced, alive. Something that carried the character of that land and those choices. Clara decided to enter it in a small regional competition, using a simple name, with no direct reference to the property. She filled out the forms with trembling hands, hoping not to create too many expectations. For her, that was already an intimate victory. She did not imagine the effect it would have. On the day the results were announced, Clara almost did not go. She felt she did not belong in that environment. Well-dressed producers, rehearsed speeches, loud laughter. She sat in the back, ready to leave early. When they called the name of her wine, there was a brief silence. Clara took time to understand that it was hers. She stood up confused, feeling her legs weaken, while some whispered, trying to figure out who she was. The award did not bring only recognition. It brought questions. Local journalists wanted to know the story, buyers made contact, technicians asked to visit the property. Clara responded with caution, choosing simple words, avoiding exaggeration. She did not speak of revenge or grand overcoming. She spoke of work, time, and respect for the land. That posture annoyed some and unsettled others. Among the annoyed were Alvaro's heirs. When they realized the value that land could reach, they tried to act quickly. They appeared with lawyers, alleging irregularities in the will, questioning ownership, raising suspicions about the origin of the water. Clara felt the old fear return, but this time she was neither alone nor unprepared. Helena helped gather documents, old records, maps that proved everything was legal. Formal justice was slow and limited. It was discovered that the original will had been manipulated, but the deadline for contestation had already passed. There was no direct punishment, nor official correction of the error. Even so, public exposure had an effect. Investors distanced themselves from the heirs, debts came to light, lawsuits piled up. Those who had laughed at Clara began to avoid her gaze. Meanwhile, her winery grew. New batches, better structure, careful partnerships. Clara refused aggressive proposals, preferring to move forward slowly. Each decision was made with the same principle she had learned in the field: nothing forced lasts. The property once seen as a curse became a reference. People who had never spoken to her now asked for advice. The most intense moment came on a quiet afternoon. Clara was walking through the vineyard when she found one of the heirs, alone, observing the land. He tried to speak, to justify choices, to blame the past. Clara listened in silence. When he finished, she simply said that the vineyard had always responded to those who respected it. There was no anger in her voice, only acknowledgement. The man left without looking back, defeated not by words, but by facts. True justice did not come from courts or speeches. It came from the complete reversal of destinies. The discarded land now sustained a profitable winery, while those responsible for the contempt accumulated losses. Clara did not celebrate that fall. She felt something deeper, a sense of inner closure. The cycle of humiliation had been broken, not by destroying the other, but by building herself. On the day she signed the legal purchase of the rest of the property, Clara walked to the old gate and opened it completely. Not to expel anyone, but to symbolize something she had never had. Choice. Freedom. Belonging. The vineyard was no longer an inherited punishment, but a consolidated achievement. At the end of that season, Clara's wine began to be exported. The numbers grew, the awards multiplied. People spoke of millions, of success, of an example. Clara listened to it all with a certain distance. For her, the true climax had happened much earlier, in the moment she decided not to sell, not to run away, not to accept the imposed destiny. Everything that came afterward was consequence. And while the spotlights turned toward the prosperous winery, few remembered the man who had tried to turn an inheritance into humiliation. His name slowly disappeared, swallowed by time. Clara's did not. It remained linked to the land, to silent work, and to the justice that is built when no one is watching. The following years passed without haste, but with firmness. Clara learned that true prosperity does not arrive in explosions, but in layers. The winery grew the way the vineyard had grown, respecting limits, accepting pauses, correcting mistakes before they became ruins. She continued waking up early, walking between the rows, touching the earth with her own hands. Money began to exist in abundance, but it never became the center of everything. It was a tool, not an identity. The old main house, once a symbol of oppression, was renovated with care. Clara kept some rough walls, not for economy, but for memory. She wanted to remember where she had come from, not as punishment, but as reference. She transformed part of the space into a practical school for rural workers from the region. Simple people, discredited as she once had been, learned their techniques, soil reading, basic management. Clara did not present herself as a heroic example. She simply shared what she had learned by making mistakes. The dry vineyard had become a living, diverse, resilient organism. It was not the largest in the region, nor the most luxurious. But it had something that buyers and specialists recognized without difficulty: coherence. Each bottle carried a story that did not need to be exaggerated. The market responded. The winery began to generate millions, international contracts were signed, important awards arrived. Even so, Clara continued wearing simple clothes and avoiding long interviews. In one of them, she was asked whether she felt satisfaction when thinking about the fate of those who had humiliated her. Clara remained silent for a few seconds. She said that the greatest justice she knew was no longer needing to think about it. She explained that living while trying to prove something to someone keeps a person trapped in the past. She had chosen something else. She had chosen to build something that no one could take away, because it did not depend on anyone's permission. Helena followed everything for as long as her health allowed. One calm afternoon, sitting in the shade of the vines, the teacher smiled and said that Clara had learned the hardest lesson: not to repeat the violence she had received. Not long after, Helena passed away. Clara planted a tree near the underground spring in her honor. There were no plaques or speeches. Only roots growing where there had once been secrecy. The community also changed. The woman once seen as disposable became a quiet reference. Not because of status, but because of consistency. Clara helped local projects, funded small producers, created exchange networks. She never presented herself as a savior. She knew that no one saves anyone. The most one can do is open paths and not block them. One morning, Clara found in the old shed the apron she had worn for years as a maid. It was torn, stained, almost falling apart. She held the fabric for a few moments, feeling the symbolic weight of that object. She thought about throwing it away, but decided to keep it. Not as a bitter reminder, but as proof that dignity does not depend on where one starts, but on the choices made when no one is watching. Success did not erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. Clara still remembered the fear, the hunger, the shame. Those memories did not disappear. They simply stopped commanding her decisions. She understood that overcoming is not forgetting, but integrating. The past became a route, not a chain. When someone new arrived at the property, expecting to find a story of revenge or sudden miracle, Clara disappointed them. She talked about slow work, repeated mistakes, difficult nights. She spoke of patience as one speaks of something concrete, tangible. Some lost interest. Others stayed. Those were the ones who understood. The vineyard that had been left as punishment became a discreet symbol of something greater. Not of triumph over enemies, but of autonomy. Clara never publicly prosecuted Alvaro's memory. She did not need to. His name disappeared naturally, replaced by the result of his own choices. The true legacy was not destroying him, but making him irrelevant. In the end, Clara understood that the cruelest inheritance can become the most powerful, depending on who receives it. What was delivered to humiliate became raw material for construction. Not because the world changed, but because she changed the way she positioned herself within it. Walking through the vineyard at dusk, Clara felt something close to gratitude. Not for the suffering, but for the ability to pass through it without becoming bitter. She knew that not everyone would have the same opportunities, nor the same endings. Even so, she believed that knowledge, patience, and dignity were possible seeds in any soil. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments what you thought of the story and which city or country you are watching from. Stories like this remain alive when they are shared, not as a promise of wealth, but as a reminder that no one needs to accept the role they tried to impose.